Hi everyone, my name is Taylor Munson and this is my 699 presentation for Morningside College. My research study is called Effects of a Phonics for Reading Intervention on Third Grade Students' FAST Scores. The big problem that drove me to design this research study was the fact that being literate is one of the most critical indicators of prosperity and success for somebody's entire life. And right now, nearly half of all elementary students in the United States are reading below grade level. And that means that upwards of 70% of those readers are requiring some kind of additional reading support or intervention. And studies have continued to indicate the importance of developing that reading fluency early on to help people succeed throughout their educational career. And the choices that students are able to make throughout their educational career, things like making the step to go to college or getting that additional education, is going to help close that achievement gap and overall help people succeed in whatever career path they might choose later on. Besides that important problem to consider, my personal why for choosing this topic was because fluency intervention is really at the forefront of what I do as a literacy teacher or as a gen ed teacher, just supporting my readers in my own classroom. So I wanted to feel comfortable and just have a deeper understanding of how these interventions are affecting my students and how they might be impacting the assessments that I'm frequently giving. A quick review of the literature that I found here, kind of the overarching theme was that reading fluency requires decoding skills, which then develops the fluent reader and acts as a bridge between the reader and the comprehension side of things. So what I did was look at some past interventions that weren't necessarily supporting all of the components necessary to develop the whole reader. The first intervention that I looked at was the multiple exemplars strategy. And 2 studies showed really no significant difference at all when this was implemented, and there was just really no impact on fluency scores whatsoever. It didn't allow for generalization of skills, but rather isolated students to increase their scores on one text rather than through all of the reading that they do. Another intervention that didn't support fluency rates at all was when students were targeted as word callers. And these interventions really just instructed them to regurgitate and memorize words rather than learning how to use them and how to apply them no matter the context. So all in all, it was difficult to find an intervention that was providing an all-encompassing instruction to support, like I said, the whole reader. So improving reading fluency really requires work in 3 essential areas, including accuracy, automaticity, and then the oral reading prosody. And it was my hope that a phonics intervention was going to provide instruction in all 3 areas. As far as the framework goes, the cognitive learning theory and the 4-part processing model really encompass all that my students were demonstrating throughout this study, or were going to. Really, it just reminds us that the brain processes information much like a computer. The way it's taking in information, developing ideas, and then using that. So examples throughout this intervention would be things like encoding and decoding, and just the students showing us how they're actually processing information. So nurturing these functions of the brain definitely is an essential component to any good reading instruction. The purpose of my quantitative study was to determine the impact that the phonics intervention was going to have on fluency scores, and my dependent variable here was the assessment results that came after my intervention. And I used the FAST CBMR, curriculum-based measurement and reading assessment, to monitor weekly fluency scores. So my hypothesis was that following this intervention, my 3rd graders' FAST scores would increase. The participants in my study included 15 of my students from my gen ed classroom, 3 of which were special education students. All 3 had IEPs specifically in reading. And for a small group of 15 students, I had a pretty wide variety of SES and racial backgrounds. Again, my phonics for reading intervention materials were used in forms of daily work packets that my students had access to, things like leveled texts and different pattern activities. And then, like I said earlier, the FAST-CBMR was my tool for assessment in both the baseline and intervention phases. My procedures included 5 20-minute sessions per week. The intervention phase started with an introduction, syllable type work, and then the core instruction focused on a different component each day. Just that way I could have that overarching or all-encompassing, I should say, intervention that other interventions had been lacking in the past. As far as data analysis goes, I chose to use paired t-tests to determine significant differences between mean word per minute scores and baseline scores. So intervention and baseline scores were compared there. And I used the FAST-CBMR scores that were actually automatically graphed for me, which made it pretty simple to analyze at the conclusion of my intervention. Digging into my results here, I went ahead and posted the chart that I put in my final paper just to give you a snapshot of the mean scores that I was referring to just a second ago. What you can see here is that I started with the pre-baseline scores and took it all the way up to my treatment 2 scores. And what I want to draw your attention to the most is the most significant findings that I had. And that came when I compared the baseline 1 to the treatment 1, and when I compared the baseline 2 to treatment 2. What you can see here is that the baseline 1 was significantly lower at 56.3, and comparing that to treatment 1 of 65.1 showed significant difference as I kind of kicked off this research study. Then my most significant finding, or the most significant difference that I found, came when comparing baseline 2 at 73.2 to treatment 2, which jumped all the way to 93.8. So really promising results there, and what my hypothesis was predicting. Now, where things got a little bit tricky and my most surprising findings were when you look across all mean scores. It was anticipated that during the baseline phases, when the intervention was removed, that these mean scores would drop. But as you can see in my chart here, those scores continued to grow even upon the removal of the intervention. So like I said, a little bit surprising and unanticipated. And I have a couple of different things that could have played a role in that, and a couple of recommendations to help kind of clear some of that up. So where I spent the most of my time thinking and reflecting was for the implications and the limitations, and then recommendations that I had for the purposes of this intervention and study. First off, I will go ahead and talk about the implications for my students, or any students in this intervention. So student motivation is where I focused most of my time. I found that with any instruction, engagement it's necessary. It's almost mandatory for acquiring skills. And when I was working with these kiddos, I found, or kind of developed, the idea that students really need to be encouraged to understand the bigger picture of the instruction that we're giving them. And that could be true for this intervention, a math intervention, or a writing intervention. No matter what, students are going to have a bigger buy-in if they know why we're doing it and what it's going to lead to down the road. So focusing our attention on student motivation is kind of key here to help them succeed. Implications for teachers are there as well. What I found was that the small student-to-teacher ratio, in combination with kind of the commonly known intervention materials, allowed for a much, much deeper understanding of what was being taught and how it should be taught. I think this also allowed for kind of a more targeted instruction approach in each area of literacy. like I was saying, is so important to developing that whole reader. So while this phonics for reading intervention focused the most on fluency, it still had components of comprehension weaved in there, which was really kind of perfect. Remember, this fluency work focused on decoding and accuracy and pace and speed, etc. But I think the implication here, or the importance here, is that when teachers are able to work with this small group of students and really dig deep into their knowledge of the content being taught, each of these areas that we're focused on is going to be that much better, and the instruction is going to be that much better when the right intervention is being used. Finally, parents, there are implications for them as well. I think, again, all teachers would agree with me that parents, they have to be involved. They should be involved to help their students succeed. And as far as reading goes, students don't have to just read at school. I think that parents should be expected to help their students find time for reading outside of school. And I think that continued intervention or continued support of the work being done at school is kind of critical to just the expansive learning that could be done if students are supported by their parents at home. So that parent involvement component, I think, is one of the most important things for us as educators to remember as we move forward with any instruction we're giving our students. And lastly, I will share just a couple of limitations and recommendations that I found after reflecting on my study. First of all, my sample size was really small. Only 15 students with a variety of skill levels really didn't allow for as much targeted instruction as I would have hoped for. I think that eventually, or in the future, having enough students to form a group for maybe even each phonics pattern would really allow students to receive more differentiated, targeted, personalized instruction that would likely yield higher fluency rates for them. Another limitation that I found was the short time period that I gave this intervention. And I think a limitation of that limitation was that an effect, I should say, of that limitation is that I got inconsistent data. I shared with you before that my mean scores increased in all 4 phases of this study, and that unexpected data, I think, could be balanced out, or more questions could be answered about that data if more time was allowed to implement this intervention and to really just try to find a true understanding of why these fluency rates were changing, what other factors might have played a role in this continued growth in my students. And finally, uncontrollable circumstances, just outside of my control. Again, kind of like that implication for parents, is that support outside the classroom is critical to success. Reading just can't stop at school. In order to develop proficiency, students have to read with fidelity at home too. So it's recommended for future studies that students are actually required to have a take-home component of this intervention to help bridge that gap between the work being done at home and what is already being done at school. So this could be as simple as taking a component of the intervention and just providing it or giving it as homework rather than doing it in a small group. And lastly, reading is complicated. There are so many components that need support to be a proficient reader that you can't cover it in the time that we're given. And it's recommended that interventions support reading components over the course of the whole year rather than just in these short bursts of isolated instruction like in this intervention. So more time is going to equal better results. And I think everyone would agree that we need more time in our day to provide the best instruction that we can for our students. Thanks for watching.